This is a presentation put together by Graham and me, Yajusapith, and we are presenting about a requirement elicitation technique called introspection. And what introspection is it is an idea or a set of ideas that a requirements engineer has about what the stakeholders want from a project that they're working on, or it's basically a set of assumptions that they have about the stakeholders' goals and desires. Now, this sets a really good starting point for other techniques to come after this, other requirement elicitation techniques, such as, let's say, interviews or surveys that they need to conduct with a group of people. They turn out very effective when they are based on these assumptions, based on introspections, basically. It sets a really good basis for them. Now, the advantages of using this technique is that it is one of the cheapest one among all the eliciting techniques out there. It doesn't require much. Um, And like we talked about, it provides a really good starting point for other requirement elicitation techniques to come. And another thing is that this technique can be very effective when the requirements engineer actually is experienced in that field, experienced about the process that goes behind the project that they're working on. Basically, is familiar with the domain that they're working on and has some idea of the goals that the stakeholders might have. It can be very effective. For example, let's say we as students are very familiar with homeworks and we know what we want out of a homework scheduling program. Now we will talk about this later in the presentation, but we are more familiar with that, so we can use this technique more effectively. Now it is true that it can be very useful, very effective for them to be familiar, but it is not this technique does not require for them to be familiar with that. This technique does not require for the requirements engineer to be an expert in that field. It doesn't require for them to be familiar with the goals or have any experience with the process at all. But it can, however, be effective if that is the case. Now let me hand it over to Graham here to talk about the next slide.
Thanks, Yichu. So when and when not to use introspection. So when to use introspection is when the requirements engineer or business analyst is familiar with the domain and goals of the project. When the requirements engineer wants to get a better understanding of the system's property needed to make the project/system successful. So for example, for the homework scheduling app, I've been a student for a very long time. So I would be, if I was a requirements engineer, I would have a good domain and idea of goals for the stakeholder for the app we're building. When you wouldn't want to use introspection is when maybe if I was the requirements engineer, I don't have any familiarity with the domain or goals of the stakeholder. Let's say I was on a project with a stakeholder that was building agricultural tech, and I've never been a farmer, never dealt with any of that. I wouldn't necessarily maybe want to use introspection. I also wouldn't want to use introspection midway through the elicitation process. It's much more effective to have it at the beginning. It's great to kind of build build your foundation to start with and use it with other techniques. It's not something that you want to use midway through. So to kind of piggyback on the example of our homework scheduling application, so kind of in my experience, these are some of the things that I would need or want from a homework scheduling application. I'd want to be able to schedule due dates. I'd be able to want to have notifications based on a time frame that I, as the user, specify. So if, one user might want to know that he has homework due a day ahead of time, or maybe somebody else wants to know when the homework is due a couple days ahead of time. I also, one thing that I really like about iLearn is that there is a link of the homework assignment in the calendar view or the weekday view, and you can be able to quickly go to that assignment or the site. And so that's something that I really like that would be nice to have in a homework scheduling application. Some extra wants, just nice to haves, being able to display the amount of time to complete an assignment. Maybe that's something that a user puts themselves in. Maybe they're faster at completing certain assignments than others, or maybe it's the instructor adding that in. Another nice to have would be like a Pomodoro clock. I like to work in sprints, and so that might be really nice to have. So I don't have to go to another application. It's just right there. It's simple and easy to use. And another nice to have would be like an email notification, like, hey, you had something past due. So this is kind of an introspection technique, kind of making the assumptions of probably what some users would want, and kind of it's just a good like base foundation. There's much more other ways to find other requirements, but it kind of gives you a good kind of foundation and goals of what the application might need. So to kind of go over the summary of what we've been talking about for introspection. Introspection involves a requirement engineer making assumptions about the stakeholder's goals and desires, also understanding the business processes used by the stakeholder. It's effective when the analyst is familiar with that process of business process or with the domain or the goals of the stakeholder/users. A good starting point for a requirement elicitation process is introspection, and it's best used at the beginning of your elicitation process. So this is something that you want to do at the beginning. You don't want to do it midway. You want to do it at the very start. It gives you a good foundation. So this is the end of our presentation, and we hope you enjoyed learning about introspection, and good luck on the test.